Good day, economics students. Continuing with our discussion of income inequality. So we're in subsection 5 of chapter 15 in your textbook, second edition. And in this subsection, before we get back to income inequality, there's a distinction I want to make clear. It's discussed in Clear It Up in subsection 5. And there is a distinction between wealth and income. Income is the flow of money you have coming into your household over a period of time. Monthly or yearly, annually, are typically the ways that income is measured. So that would be your paycheck if you're working, or your Social Security check if you're retired for most Americans. Income is that flow of money coming into the household. Wealth is your accumulated assets as of now. So that would be the money you have in your bank accounts, the money you have in investment accounts. For many Americans, the equity value of their home, the amount they've paid off on the loan they paid to buy they took out to buy their home, or if they paid it off, like, some people, older folks do have their houses paid off, that's the value of the home. So all that bundled together is your wealth. And your book points out that for many retired folks, their income is actually very low every month. It may only be a Social Security check. And as I pointed out, to my knowledge, the most you can hope to get from a Social Security check today is about $1,210 a month. It's not much. Don't rely on Social Security alone, brothers and sisters, for your retirement, because you may be able to survive, but you will not thrive on just Social Security alone. You don't want that. We're talking cracker box, efficiency apartment, pork and beans for dinner on a regular basis, and no trips anywhere. It's a survival amount, not a flourishing amount, Social Security. But instead, most Americans save for their retirement. And so their accumulated wealth is actually pretty high. They've invested in paying off houses. There's a lot of assets. A lot of people have a lot of wealth built up in their house by the time they retire. 401ks, several $100,000 to millions even, for even middle-class people by the time they retire. And then you supplement that Social Security by bleeding off the wealth for the rest of your life, hoping the wealth lasts as long as you do. So you can continue to have a pleasant retirement. But anyway, so income is the flow of money coming in monthly or annually. Wealth is your accumulated assets. So that's an important distinction. All right. Government policies to discourage income inequality. And it is a burden on an economy if many people don't have much money and a relative handful have a vast amount of money. Your consumer base is tiny. And the ultra rich, there is only so much money they can spend. There are only so many mansions you can buy, so many luxury cars you can own, so many servants you can employ. A billionaire simply doesn't put hundreds of millions of dollars back into the economy by their purchases. They just don't. So economies are healthier when you don't have a whole vast sea of poor people and a tiny number of very rich people. Instead, it helps to have a more equitable distribution. And we talked in the last lecture about different countries around the world. The developing world often has very skewed, where there's a handful of very rich people and a lot of not so well-off people. And then some European countries, Germany, Sweden, have very high tax rates, for example. They have government policies designed to keep there from being an ultra rich. They're wealthy people, very wealthy people, but they're not, I don't know if that's a fact. I don't think there are any Swedish billionaires. I don't think their government policies will let there be Swedish billionaires. But there are many, many times over multimillionaires in Sweden. So they're okay with you getting rich, just not super, super duper rich. Anyway. So how do they do this? How do these governments encourage more income inequality, less income inequality? The crucial thing is usually, for many of these countries, redistribution. That means Robin Hood style, taking from the rich to give to the poor. And the way this is typically done, the most common method, is a progressive income tax. Progressive income tax. The progress in progressive here is the rate of taxation of the income that goes up as the income goes up. So in country A, very poor people, people at poverty line, near the poverty line, may pay 15% of their income in taxes. People of middle incomes typically might pay 25% of their income in taxes, and the very wealthy pay 35% of their income in taxes. Now, part of the reason is this is an attempt to redistribute wealth, and that money is going to be taken from the rich, and government programs that benefit the broader society will take that money and it'll be spent on them. So poorer people are going to get welfare payments that are out of these rich people's income taxes coming in. It's redistribution. And it is every industrialized state, everyone has progressive income taxes, including the United States. Now, our marginal tax rates are actually lower than almost any other industrial state. You may think your taxes are very high, but compared to Europe or Japan, the taxes are actually considerably lower in the United States than in those countries because they have a much more aggressive redistribution scheme than we do. But the reason why this is thought just for the very rich, the well off, to pay a higher percentage of their income is simply that it simply doesn't damage them as much. If you're already earning $40 million a year, it simply will not impoverish you the same way to take another 10% of your high income than it would to somebody who's making $30,000 a year. To take 10% of their income, it takes $3,000 off. They're living on $27,000. Whereas if you make $40 million, you're going to have to scrabble by on $36 million, right, a year in income. And I think they'll manage. Okay. And so this is an intentional redistribution of wealth. It is taking from the rich to benefit the poorer citizens. Every industrialized country does this. In the United States, though, there once was a much higher tax bracket. In fact, for most of the history of the income tax until the early 1980s, there was a very high tax rate for very high incomes. But the Reagan tax reforms of the early 80s did away with that top bracket, and typically the wealthiest Americans have the same tax rate that middle-class Americans do. So that, many times over, multimillionaires pay the same percentage of income that probably your family does. This, again, as we talked about, supply-side economics and all that kind of thing. We'll talk more about it later in this course. Anyway, the effective tax rate, that's another term that you see in your book. The effective tax rate is the total taxes paid divided by income. Now, this is actually an important figure because you probably figured this out already. Wealthy people can afford to pay excellent tax lawyers and accountants. And these experts know how to work the tax code, how to recommend tax breaks, where to put your money so that it won't be taxed at a high rate. The wealthy pay a much less percentage of their income in reality than you would think, because they have these experts working to ensure they don't pay a lot of their income in taxes. And they built up, charitable giving and all these things to guarantee that they're not shelling out vast amounts of money in taxes. And it works. So the effective tax rate of the very rich is not as high as it looks on paper at first blush, because of the way they can manipulate take advantage of the things the tax code provides. I'm not saying they're breaking any laws. They don't. I'm sure they're not. In an overwhelming number of cases, they're doing what the law allows. I guess good for them. But just so you'll know, the effective tax rate is really what you're shelling out in taxes. Okay, and it's not, for especially people who can get this good professional advice, going to be as high as it looks at first blush. All right. Another way that government policies can encourage less income inequality is what's called the ladder of opportunity. You have to just recognize that in the real world, not just abstractly, but in real life, your income is probably dependent on a lot of things beyond yourself. You might be smart as a whip. You might work really hard. But the fact of the matter is that part of the reason people get good jobs is usually, not 100% of the time, I know there are exceptions, usually because they had excellent educations, and almost always they came from families that equipped them to have this future success. If you have two college-educated parents, they are going to be equipped to foster your own education in a way that you simply won't if you're being raised by a single mother who didn't graduate from high school. The vocabulary you encounter from the cradle on up in your home is going to be richer. The ideas that are bandied around as you're growing up are going to be more complicated. You're going to develop a mind that is prepared better to flourish based on the family you grow up in. That's just a sociological fact. Can government policies help to correct some of the disadvantages to the people on the low-income side? That's the idea. Head Start programs, for example, government programs intended for poor young children, preschool-age kids, to give them a boost so that when they get to regular elementary school, they're not already way behind because they have illiterate or barely illiterate parents. They've gotten a little extra boost from a government program to help them overcome some of those disadvantages of their home life, their poverty, and the parents' education levels and so on. So Head Start would be an example of that. Now, to formal schooling. People who earn the big bucks on Wall Street often go to excellent public schools or superb private schools. Their families are wealthy enough they can pay for them to go to the best private schools in the country. Then they apply and they get into and can afford to go to Harvard and Stanford and University of Chicago and Yale and the other elite universities of our country, where recruiters come and pluck them right out of their bachelor's programs to take $2 million a year salaries on Wall Street. They're not average Americans. They come from very wealthy and accomplished families to start with that can pay for those excellent educations. Can government policies do something to improve the public schools that poorer students have to go to? Sure. There's constant debate about how do we improve the quality of public education for the people who have to settle for their local public school. They just don't have the money for any other option. Can we do something to encourage community colleges to be better educations, better prepared to equip people for good paying jobs? Public universities, how can we help kids to get into them and stay in them and graduate so they can get better jobs? So, these would be government policies to include what's called the ladder, like climb the ladder of opportunity. The rich kids from well-educated homes get those advantages automatically. The poor have essentially none of the advantages I've just mentioned to you. They often go to very poor public schools and drop out early, and college isn't even an option. Or they try community college, but they've got to work so many hours they just can't graduate with even an associate's degree. It happens all the time. Can government policies change those things? Internships, apprenticeships for people who've graduated from school, finished their formal schooling to help them get better paying jobs down the road. Another way you can overcome some income inequalities is inheritance taxes. When people die and they pass on wealth to their kids, that's wealth that benefits their kids that they mostly didn't earn, right? Their parents are the ones who earned it. Now, almost all Americans have an almost instinctive desire to leave what they leave behind to their kids. Certainly, everybody can understand that. But again, most industrialized countries say that above a certain level, a chunk of that should go to the greater good of the nation. Because at a certain level, you're already going to be pretty dang well off if your parents are rich and they leave you their fortune. So we do have inheritance taxes in the United States. I know the Republican Party has long wanted to get rid of them, but they still do exist. But you should know that very few people have to pay any inheritance taxes at all until the wealth their parents are leaving exceeds $4.5 million. So the average American has no worry about inheritance taxes at all. They simply won't affect them. You have to leave an estate over $4.5 million before they even kick in. And even at that level, they're not enormously burdensome. I forget. No, it's I've reversed that. It's 5.43 million. 5.43 million, over almost $5.5 million before inheritance taxes even start. And they're not enormously high even at that. So if you leave your kids, you're successful, one day you leave your kids $50 million, they're going to walk away with a lion's share of that $50 million. Not to mention the fact that you can create trusts, get a good lawyer to make your will. They can create a testamentary trust. The kids will get the benefit of the trust to live off vast amounts of income from it. And it doesn't get taxed if it goes into a trust. Okay? So there are ways around that. The last section of the book points out that there are trade-offs. You can try to increase income equality, and that has benefits. More money in the pockets of the poorer portions of society stimulates an economy. But if you say tax the well-off very highly, this might be a disincentive to entrepreneurship. There may be people who'd say, well, I'd like to start that business, but I've got a good enough life now, and if I did earn a lot more money, the government just take 90% of it anyway. And they may decide not to invest. There is often a worry about this. People debate how real this is. Are people really not going to start that company because if they get super successful, the government's going to take too big a chunk of the money? I don't know. But people do worry about it as a disincentive to creativity and entrepreneurship and making a country stronger. So it is debated. And in your book points out that you can carefully craft government policies to encourage more income inequality up to a point, but then make sure you don't go too far because you might sap some of the drive in your economy. That's the last little section. Okay, guys, we'll take up the labor markets next time. God bless.